The desert wind carried dust across the mesa, as Sarah Running Wolf crouched behind the red rocks, watching the lone cowboy tend to his horses below. The year was 1887, and the Apache reservation felt more like a prison with each passing day. Her people were hungry, their traditional hunting grounds now forbidden territory marked by barbed wire and government signs. The Indian agent had cut their food rations again, claiming budget shortfalls, while his own belly grew rounder each month. Sarah's dark eyes studied the cowboy's movements with the patience her grandfather had taught her. This white man was different from the soldiers and settlers who usually rode through Apache territory. He moved with respect around his animals, speaking to them in low, gentle tones. His hands were calloused from honest work, not soft like the government officials who made decisions about her people's fate from comfortable offices hundreds of miles away. The cowboy's name was Thomas McKenna, though Sarah didn't know this yet. He had been riding the borderlands between Arizona and New Mexico for 3 years, delivering messages and supplies between remote settlements. Unlike many men of his profession, Thomas had learned to appreciate the harsh beauty of the desert and the wisdom of its original inhabitants. He had traded fairly with Apache bands when their paths crossed, offering tobacco and metal goods for information about safe water sources and dangerous terrain. Sarah's stomach cramped with hunger as she watched Thomas brush down his magnificent black stallion. The horse was clearly his pride, a powerful animal that could outrun most Indian ponies across the rocky desert floor. Her younger brother had been sick for weeks, and the medicine man said he needed strength that only proper food could provide. The reservation's meager supplies wouldn't sustain him much longer. The Apache way had always been to take what was needed for survival, especially from those who had more than enough. Sarah's father had been a respected warrior before the government forced their surrender, and he had taught her that honor came from protecting family, not from following the white man's laws that seemed designed to slowly starve them into submission. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Sarah made her decision. She had been watching this particular trail for weeks, learning the patterns of travelers who used it. Most were heavily armed groups who would shoot first and ask questions later if they encountered an Apache. But this solitary cowboy presented an opportunity that might not come again. Thomas was setting up his evening camp when Sarah finally moved. She had inherited her father's skill at moving silently across any terrain, a talent that had kept Apache warriors alive for generations. The cowboy's back was turned as he arranged his bedroll near a small fire, and his rifle leaned against a rock several feet away. His horses were hobbled but alert, their ears twitching at sounds only they could hear. Sarah stepped into the firelight with the fluid grace of someone born to the desert. She held no weapon, but her presence was commanding enough to freeze Thomas in place. For a long moment they studied each other across the flickering flames, each recognizing something unexpected in the other's eyes. Thomas slowly straightened to his full height, his hands visible and empty. He had heard enough stories to know that Apache women could be as dangerous as their male counterparts, perhaps more so when protecting their families. But something about this woman's bearing suggested she was driven by necessity rather than malice. Sarah spoke first, her English heavily accented but clear. She had learned the language at the mission school before her family fled back to the traditional ways. The words felt strange on her tongue after months of speaking only Apache, but she needed this white man to understand her completely. The conversation that followed would change both their lives forever. Sarah explained her situation with the direct honesty that was characteristic of her people. Her brother was dying, her family was hungry, and the government's promises of care for the Apache had proven as empty as rain clouds that never delivered water to the thirsty earth. Thomas listened without interruption, recognizing the desperation behind her controlled exterior. He had seen similar scenes at other reservations during his travels. The slow starvation of proud peoples who had once thrived in this harsh but beautiful land. The sight had always left him feeling helpless and ashamed of his own government's policies. When Sarah finished speaking, she made her proposal with the straightforward manner that Apache culture valued. She would take his best horse, the black stallion that could carry her swiftly to places where she might find the resources her family needed to survive. She wasn't asking permission, simply stating her intention as fact. Thomas considered her words carefully, understanding that this moment balanced on a knife's edge. He could attempt to stop her, likely resulting in violence that would solve nothing for either of them. Or he could find a different path, one that might offer hope instead of simply transferring suffering from one person to another. His response surprised them both. Instead of refusing or reaching for his weapon, Thomas made a counter-proposal that revealed the kind of man he truly was beneath the dusty exterior of a frontier drifter. If she needed his horse for the dangerous work ahead, then perhaps she also needed someone who knew the country beyond the reservation, someone who could help her navigate the complex world of white settlements and trading posts. Sarah's initial reaction was suspicion mixed with disbelief. No white man had ever offered to help her people without expecting something substantial in return. The missionaries wanted their souls, the government agents wanted their compliance, and the settlers simply wanted them gone. But as she looked into Thomas's weathered face, illuminated by the dancing firelight, she saw something that had become rare in her experience with his kind: genuine compassion without hidden agenda. The desert night settled around them as they talked, two unlikely allies discovering common ground in their shared understanding of survival's harsh requirements. By the time the stars reached their full brilliance overhead, Sarah Running Wolf and Thomas McKenna had forged an agreement that would test both their courage and challenge everything they thought they knew about the boundaries between their worlds. Neither could have predicted that this chance encounter would lead them into adventures that would span 3 states, involve them with outlaws and lawmen alike, and ultimately force them to choose between the safety of their separate lives and the dangerous promise of something entirely new. The Black Stallion stood patient in the firelight, unknowing that he would carry them both toward a destiny that would reshape their understanding of loyalty, survival, and the unexpected forms that friendship could take along the frontier's unforgiving trails. Dawn broke cold and clear across the desert as Sarah Running Wolf and Thomas McKenna prepared to leave their makeshift camp. The night's conversation had transformed two strangers into unlikely partners, bound together by circumstances that neither could have imagined when the sun had set the evening before. Thomas packed his supplies with practiced efficiency, while Sarah studied the terrain ahead, her trained eyes reading the landscape like a map written in stone and shadow. The Black Stallion, whose name was Thunder according to Thomas, seemed to sense the change in routine. The powerful horse stood 17 hands high, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing in his surroundings. Sarah approached him with the respect one warrior shows another, extending her hand palm up so he could catch her scent. Thunder's initial wariness gave way to cautious acceptance as Sarah spoke to him in Apache, her voice carrying the ancient rhythm her people used when communicating with the animal spirits. Thomas watched this interaction with growing admiration for his new companion. Most people, especially those unfamiliar with horses, approached Thunder with either fear or false bravado. Sarah showed neither, instead offering the quiet confidence that came from a lifetime of working with animals in harmony, rather than dominance. Her father had taught her that all living things deserved respect, whether they walked on 2 legs or 4. Their first destination was a trading post nearly 40 miles north, where Thomas had contacts who might be willing to exchange goods without asking too many questions about their origin. The journey would take them through some of the most unforgiving terrain in the Southwest, across mesas where the summer heat could kill a man in hours, and winter nights could freeze him solid. But it would also take them away from the heavily patrolled areas where an Apache woman, traveling with a white cowboy, would attract unwanted attention. As they rode, Thomas shared what he knew about the country ahead. He had spent years learning the locations of water sources, safe camping spots, and the movements of various groups who might pose threats to travelers. Sarah contributed her own knowledge, pointing out plants that could provide food or medicine, and signs that warned of approaching weather changes that city dwellers would never notice. Their first test came sooner than expected. They had been riding for only 3 hours when Sarah suddenly signaled for silence, her hand raised in warning. Her sharp ears had caught the sound of approaching horses, still too distant for Thomas to hear. They quickly guided Thunder into a narrow canyon where red sandstone walls would conceal them from casual observation. The riders who passed were a patrol of cavalry soldiers, led by a lieutenant whose harsh voice carried clearly in the thin air. Sarah recognized him as one of the officers from the reservation, a man who treated Apache people like dangerous animals that needed constant watching. If he had seen her traveling with a white man, he would have assumed Thomas was either her prisoner or her accomplice in some crime against the government. After the soldiers disappeared toward the south, Sarah and Thomas emerged from hiding with a new understanding of the dangers they would face together. Their partnership made them both suspects in a world where racial boundaries were enforced with violence and suspicion. Thomas was now as vulnerable as Sarah, subject to accusations of being an Indian sympathizer or worse. The trading post they reached that afternoon was a weathered collection of adobe buildings clustered around a well that had drawn travelers for generations. The owner, a grizzled former mountain man named Pete Morrison, greeted Thomas with the careful friendliness that frontier businessmen showed to regular customers. His eyes lingered on Sarah with the mixture of curiosity and caution that most whites showed when encountering Apache people outside the reservation. Thomas conducted the transaction with skill born of long experience. He traded some of his extra ammunition and a silver pocket watch for supplies that Sarah's family desperately needed: flour, beans, salt, and a small bottle of medicine that might help her sick brother. Pete asked no questions about Sarah's presence, understanding that survival in this country often required alliances that didn't fit neatly into society's expectations. But as they prepared to leave, Pete pulled Thomas aside with urgent news. Word had spread about increased Apache activity off the reservation, and tensions were running high throughout the territory. The Army was offering substantial rewards for information about any Indians found outside authorized areas, and some settlers were taking matters into their own hands rather than waiting for official action. This information changed everything about their return journey. The direct route back to Apache territory was now too dangerous, patrolled by both military units and civilian groups looking for Indians to capture or kill. They would need to take a much longer path, adding days to their travel time while Sarah's brother grew sicker with each passing hour. Sarah accepted this news with the stoic determination that was her heritage. Her people had survived centuries of hardship by adapting to circumstances beyond their control, and she would not allow frustration to cloud her judgment now. But Thomas could see the worry in her eyes, the fear that their efforts might come too late to save the young boy who depended on their success. Their alternate route took them through territory that Thomas had never seen before, rugged country where ancient volcanic activity had created a maze of canyons, mesas, and hidden valleys. Sarah proved invaluable as a guide, reading the subtle signs that indicated safe passages through what seemed like impassable terrain. Her knowledge came not from maps or formal education, but from generations of Apache wisdom passed down through stories and direct experience. On their second night together, camped in a sheltered hollow where their fire couldn't be seen from the surrounding ridges, Thomas and Sarah began to share more personal stories. Thomas spoke of his childhood in Missouri, where his family had struggled to maintain their small farm against drought, debt, and the social upheaval following the Civil War. His decision to come west had been driven by the same desperation that now motivated Sarah: the need to find a way to survive when traditional options had disappeared. Sarah told him about her life before the reservation, when her band had moved freely across their ancestral homeland, following seasonal patterns that had sustained her people for countless generations. She described the gradual encroachment of white settlements, the broken promises of government agents, and the final surrender that had traded freedom for the promise of security that never materialized. These conversations revealed how much they shared despite their different backgrounds. Both had been shaped by loss and the struggle to maintain dignity in the face of circumstances beyond their control. Both understood what it meant to be displaced from the life they had expected to live, forced to create new identities in a changing world. As they talked, Thunder grazed nearby, his presence a constant reminder of the bond that had brought them together. The great horse had accepted Sarah completely, responding to her touch and voice as readily as he did to Thomas's commands. This acceptance seemed to symbolize the trust that was growing between his human companions, a friendship that transcended the racial boundaries that divided their society. The desert night sky stretched endlessly above them, filled with stars that had watched over travelers in this land long before white men or Apache had arrived to claim it. In that vast silence, broken only by the distant howl of coyotes and the soft sounds of thunder moving through the sparse grass, Sarah and Thomas found a peace that neither had experienced in months. Tomorrow would bring new dangers and difficult decisions, but for this moment they had found something precious: the companionship of someone who understood their struggles without judgment or pity. The third day of their journey brought unexpected complications that would test both Sarah's wilderness skills and Thomas's growing understanding of Apache survival tactics. They had been following a narrow deer trail through dense pine forest when Thunder suddenly became agitated, his ears swiveling toward sounds that his human companions couldn't yet detect. Sarah immediately dismounted and pressed her ear to the ground, reading vibrations that told her story of approaching riders. What she heard made her blood run cold. At least a dozen horses were moving toward them from the east, their pace suggesting urgency rather than casual travel. The rhythmic pattern indicated military discipline. This was likely another cavalry patrol, larger and more determined than the one they had avoided 2 days earlier. Worse still, the riders were using the same trail that Sarah and Thomas had been following, meaning they would be impossible to avoid in the dense forest. Thomas trusted Sarah's judgment completely by now, and he quickly began looking for alternatives to their current path. The forest pressed close on both sides of the trail, with thick undergrowth that would be nearly impossible to navigate on horseback. Behind them lay open country where they would be visible for miles, while ahead the trail continued through similar terrain for at least another mile before reaching higher ground. Sarah made a decision that surprised Thomas with its boldness. Instead of seeking a hiding place or trying to outrun their pursuers, she led Thunder directly off the trail and into what appeared to be impenetrable brush. Her sharp eyes had spotted something that Thomas had missed, a game trail used by elk and deer, invisible to casual observation, but wide enough for a careful horse and rider to navigate. They plunged into the green twilight of the deep forest, following Sarah's lead as she guided them through a maze of fallen logs, dense thickets, and steep ravines that would have defeated most travelers. Thunder, despite his size, moved through this obstacle course with the grace of a much smaller horse, responding to Sarah's quiet voice and gentle touch with complete trust. The sounds of the approaching patrol grew louder as they worked their way deeper into the wilderness. Thomas could hear voices now, the harsh commands of a sergeant directing his men to spread out and search the area more thoroughly. Someone had reported seeing tracks that didn't match normal traffic on this trail, and the military was taking no chances with potential Apache activity so far from the reservation. For 2 hours, Sarah led them through terrain that seemed impossible for horses to traverse. They crossed streams on fallen logs, descended cliff faces using deer paths barely wide enough for Thunder's hooves, and crawled through tunnels of vegetation that scraped against their backs and tore at their clothes. All the while, Sarah maintained the steady pace that would keep them ahead of their pursuers without exhausting their mount. Finally, they emerged onto a high ridge that offered a commanding view of the country they had just escaped. Below them, the cavalry patrol was still searching the main trail, their frustration evident even from a distance. The sergeant had dismounted his men to examine tracks more carefully, but Sarah's skill at concealing their passage had left him with nothing but questions and suspicion. Thomas looked at Sarah with new respect as they watched the soldiers eventually give up their search and continue along the main trail. Her knowledge of this country went far beyond simple familiarity. She understood it at a level that came from generations of people who had lived in harmony with its rhythms and secrets. Every plant, rock formation, and animal path held information that she could read like words on a page. But their escape had cost them valuable time and taken them far from their intended route. The medicine for Sarah's brother was still in Thomas's saddlebags, but they were now at least 50 miles from Apache territory, with no clear path home. Worse still, the increased military activity suggested that tensions were escalating throughout the region, making travel even more dangerous for their unlikely partnership. As they made camp that evening in a secluded valley fed by a clear mountain stream, Sarah shared more of her personal story with Thomas. Her brother, whose Apache name translated roughly as Bright Star, was only 12 years old but already showed signs of becoming a respected member of their band. He had inherited their father's quick mind and their mother's gentle spirit, making him popular among both children and adults on the reservation. The sickness that had taken hold of him seemed to resist all traditional treatments. The reservation doctor, when he bothered to visit at all, had dismissed the symptoms as simple malnutrition and suggested that the boy would recover when food became more plentiful. But Sarah's grandmother, a medicine woman with decades of experience, recognized signs that the white doctor had missed. According to the old woman's diagnosis, Bright Star was suffering from a condition that required specific treatment, not just better nutrition, but medicine that could only be obtained from traders who dealt with both Indian and white communities. The reservation's limited medical supplies contained nothing that would help, and the nearest hospital was hundreds of miles away in a city where Apache people were not welcome. Thomas listened to this account with growing anger at a system that condemned children to suffer for the political decisions of adults. He had seen similar situations throughout his travels in the West, where government policies created problems that the same government then ignored or blamed on the victims. His own younger sister had died of scarlet fever back in Missouri, partly because his family couldn't afford proper medical care, so he understood Sarah's desperation on a personal level. Their conversation was interrupted by an unexpected sound, the distant crack of gunfire echoing off the canyon walls. Both Sarah and Thomas immediately moved to positions where they could observe their surroundings while remaining hidden from view. The shots had come from the direction of the main trail, where the cavalry patrol had been searching earlier. Through Thomas's field glasses, they could see smoke rising from a location about 3 miles to the south. The pattern of gunfire suggested a running battle rather than a single engagement, with shots fired in multiple directions over a period of several minutes. When the shooting finally stopped, an ominous silence settled over the entire region. Sarah's expression grew grim as she interpreted these signs. Someone had encountered the patrol and chosen to fight rather than surrender. Given the location and timing, it was likely another Apache who had been caught away from the reservation, possibly someone she knew. The fact that the shooting had stopped so abruptly suggested that the encounter had not ended well for whoever had been trying to evade capture. This incident added urgency to their own situation. If the military had engaged with other Apache in the area, they would now be even more aggressive in their search efforts. Additional patrols would be called in, the territory would be flooded with soldiers, and anyone found traveling without proper authorization would be subject to immediate arrest or worse. Thomas proposed a bold solution to their dilemma. Instead of continuing to avoid the military presence, they should travel directly to the nearest army post and report themselves as legitimate travelers on official business. He carried documents that identified him as a courier for various government agencies, credentials that might provide cover for both of them if presented properly. Sarah initially rejected this idea as impossibly dangerous. Walking into an army post as an Apache woman would be like a rabbit volunteering to enter a wolf den, but as Thomas explained his reasoning, she began to see the wisdom in his strategy. The military would be looking for Apache trying to avoid detection, not for an Indian woman traveling openly with official escort. The plan would require Sarah to trust Thomas completely, placing her life in his hands and betting everything on his ability to convince suspicious soldiers that their partnership was both legitimate and authorized. It was a gamble that could easily result in her imprisonment or death, but it might also be their best chance of reaching her brother in time to save his life. As they settled down for what might be their last night of freedom, Sarah made her decision with the courage that had sustained her people through generations of impossible choices. She would trust this white cowboy who had already risked so much to help her, and together they would face whatever consequences awaited them at the army post. Thunder whickered softly in the darkness as if sensing the importance of the decision his human companions had just made. Fort McDowell stood like a brown scar against the desert landscape, its adobe walls and wooden buildings representing the United States government's attempt to impose order on what many soldiers still considered hostile territory. As Sarah and Thomas approached the main gate on that blazing hot afternoon, both knew they were gambling with Sarah's life on Thomas's ability to navigate the complex world of military bureaucracy and frontier prejudice. Thomas had spent the morning coaching Sarah on the story they would tell. According to their carefully crafted tale, she was a scout and translator hired to help him locate water sources for a new mail route between distant settlements. Her Apache heritage would be presented as an asset rather than a liability, essential knowledge for anyone hoping to survive in this harsh country. The documents Thomas carried as a government courier would provide the official credibility their story needed. The guards at the gate studied Sarah with obvious suspicion, their hands resting casually on their weapon butts as Thomas presented his credentials. Sergeant Murphy, a weathered Irishman with 20 years of frontier service, examined the papers with the thoroughness of someone who had seen every variety of forged document and confidence scheme the West could produce. His pale blue eyes kept returning to Sarah's face, searching for signs of deception or hostility. Thomas maintained the casual confidence of someone accustomed to dealing with military bureaucracy, answering the sergeant's questions with just the right mixture of cooperation and professional impatience. Yes, he was authorized to hire local guides when necessary. No, he hadn't encountered any hostile Indians during his travels. The woman had been recommended by traders in Santa Fe who vouched for her knowledge of water sources in the disputed territory near the Mexican border. Sarah remained silent during this exchange, playing the role of someone who understood English but preferred to communicate through her white employer. Her posture conveyed respectful attention, without the submissiveness that would have made the soldiers suspicious. She had learned from her father that showing either fear or defiance to white authorities was equally dangerous. The key was to appear useful but not threatening. After what seemed like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, Sergeant Murphy grudgingly granted them entry to the fort. However, he made it clear that Sarah would need to remain in the civilian area near the trader's store, while Thomas conducted his official business with the post commander. This arrangement actually suited their purposes perfectly, as it would give Sarah access to additional supplies while Thomas worked to secure safe passage documentation for their return journey. The post trader, a thin man named Colbert who had grown wealthy selling overpriced goods to soldiers and travelers, treated Sarah with the calculating courtesy that frontier merchants showed to anyone who might have money to spend. He was curious about her presence at the fort, but not suspicious. Apache women occasionally visited army posts to trade craft items or seek work as laundresses or guides, while Sarah examined the trader's limited selection of medicines, hoping to find something that might help her brother. Thomas met with Major Harrison, the post commander. Harrison was a by-the-book officer who had been assigned to this remote post after a series of disagreements with his superiors about Indian policy. He believed that the current system of confining Apache people to reservations while cutting their food allowances was both cruel and strategically foolish. Thomas found an unexpected ally in the major, who readily approved the documentation they needed for safe passage through military-controlled territory. Harrison's signature on their travel papers would protect them from harassment by other patrols, at least in theory. But the major also shared troubling intelligence that complicated their plan significantly. According to Harrison's sources, a group of Apache warriors had left the San Carlos reservation several days earlier, apparently heading toward the Mexico border. The military was under pressure from territorial politicians to prevent any Indians from escaping to Mexico, where they might join forces with hostile groups already operating in the Sierra Madre Mountains. Every patrol in the region had orders to stop and question any Apache found away from authorized areas. This information explained the increased military activity they had observed during their journey. It also meant that Sarah's presence outside the reservation, even with proper documentation, would attract unwanted attention from soldiers who might not take time to examine their papers carefully before taking action. Thomas pressed for more details about the military's search efforts, using his position as a government courier to justify his interest in regional security matters. What he learned made him realize that their original plan of traveling directly back to Apache territory was no longer feasible. Too many patrols were operating in that area, all of them nervous and quick to shoot first and ask questions later. Major Harrison, perhaps sensing Thomas's genuine concern for his Apache companion, suggested an alternative route that would take them far to the north, before circling back toward the reservation. This path would add at least a week to their journey, but it would avoid the areas where military activity was heaviest. For a young boy fighting for his life, that extra week might make the difference between recovery and death. When Thomas rejoined Sarah at the trader's store, he found her in animated conversation with an unexpected visitor. Maria Santos was a Mexican woman who worked as a translator and cultural liaison for the army, helping to negotiate with various Apache bands when diplomacy was preferred to violence. She had recognized Sarah as a member of a family she had met during previous negotiations, and their reunion provided both women with welcome news from their respective communities. Maria's information about conditions on the San Carlos reservation was deeply troubling. The food situation had worsened dramatically in recent weeks, with rations cut by nearly half while the number of people dependent on government supplies continued to increase. Several children had already died from malnutrition-related illnesses, and the tribal leaders were growing increasingly desperate in their attempts to find alternatives. More immediately relevant to Sarah's situation, Maria reported that her brother's condition had indeed worsened during her absence. The reservation doctor had finally visited the boy, but his examination had been cursory and his recommended treatment inadequate. The medicine woman who had been caring for him was now openly saying that his only chance for survival lay in obtaining the specific medicines that Sarah was seeking. This news added urgency to their mission while simultaneously making it more dangerous. They needed to reach the reservation as quickly as possible, but the military activity in the region made speed incompatible with safety. Any mistake in timing or navigation could result in their capture, which would not only end their mission, but potentially cost Sarah her life. As evening approached, Thomas and Sarah made their final preparations for departure. The trader had provided some of the medicines Sarah needed, though not the specific treatment her grandmother had requested. Major Harrison had given them detailed maps showing the locations of military patrols and safe camping sites along their proposed northern route. But perhaps most importantly, they had gained something invaluable from Maria Santos, current information about conditions throughout the region and contacts who might provide additional help along their journey. Maria had given Sarah the names of several Mexican families who traded regularly with Apache bands and might be willing to assist travelers with legitimate business in Indian country. As they led Thunder out of the fort under the watchful eyes of the gate guards, Sarah and Thomas both understood that the most dangerous part of their journey was just beginning. The relatively simple plan of helping one sick child had evolved into something much more complex, involving military politics, territorial tensions, and the broader struggle between indigenous peoples and an expanding United States. Thunder seemed to sense the change in his rider's mood as they rode away from the fort into the gathering dusk. The great horse had carried them safely through one challenge after another, and now he would need to draw on all his strength and endurance for the trials that lay ahead. In the distance, coyotes called to each other across the desert, their voices carrying the ancient song of survival in a land that tested every living thing that dared to call it home. The northern route proved even more challenging than Major Harrison had warned. For 5 grueling days, Sarah and Thomas navigated through country that seemed designed to test the limits of human endurance. The terrain alternated between barren desert where the sun could kill and high mountain passes, where sudden snowstorms threatened to freeze travelers solid. Thunder, despite his remarkable strength, was showing signs of strain from carrying 2 riders across such demanding landscape. Their first major obstacle came on the 4th day, when they discovered that a bridge marked on their military maps had been washed out by recent floods. The river it had spanned was now a raging torrent of snowmelt and stormwater, far too dangerous to ford with a horse carrying precious medical supplies. Sarah studied the situation with the practical problem-solving skills that Apache life had demanded from her since childhood. She identified a narrow canyon about 2 miles upstream, where the river had carved a deep but relatively calm channel between high rock walls. The water was still dangerous, but Thunder was a strong swimmer, and the current would actually help carry them toward the opposite bank if they entered at precisely the right angle. The key would be timing their crossing to avoid the floating debris that could crush a horse and rider against the canyon walls. Thomas had never attempted such a dangerous river crossing, but he trusted Sarah's judgment completely. She had already guided them safely through situations that would have defeated most travelers, demonstrating an understanding of natural hazards that came from generations of Apache wisdom. If she believed they could make it across, then he was willing to risk everything on her expertise. The crossing itself was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Thunder plunged into the icy water with the courage that had made him such a valuable companion, his powerful legs driving against the current while Sarah and Thomas clung to his back, and the precious saddlebags containing the medicine. For several heart-stopping minutes, they were at the mercy of forces far beyond their control, carried downstream by water that could easily have swept them to their deaths. But Sarah's calculations proved correct, and they emerged on the far bank exhausted but triumphant, their supplies intact and their bond as traveling companions stronger than ever. Thunder shook himself like a giant dog, spraying water in all directions. before looking back at the river with what Thomas could have sworn was equine satisfaction at having conquered such a formidable challenge. That evening, as they dried their clothes around a carefully concealed fire, Sarah shared more stories from her childhood that helped Thomas understand the depths of knowledge her people possessed about surviving in this harsh environment. Every natural feature held lessons that had been passed down through countless generations: which plants indicated underground water, how to predict weather changes from cloud formations, where to find shelter during unexpected storms. But she also spoke about the changes that reservation life had brought to her people, how traditional knowledge was being lost as young Apache were forbidden to learn the old ways. The government schools insisted on teaching only white customs and English language, treating Apache culture as something primitive that needed to be eliminated rather than preserved. Children who had once learned survival skills from their elders were now being taught to depend entirely on government, handouts, and supervision. This conversation helped Thomas understand why Sarah's mission to save her brother was about more than one child's life. It represented resistance to a system designed to destroy everything that made Apache people unique, an assertion that their traditional knowledge and values still had meaning in a world that increasingly denied their worth. Their discussion was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders moving through the darkness toward their hidden camp. Sarah immediately began scattering dirt over their fire, while Thomas gathered their weapons and prepared for trouble. The hoofbeats were moving too quietly to be a military patrol, suggesting either outlaws or Apache who were also traveling secretly through this territory. What emerged from the darkness was even more unexpected than either had anticipated. 3 Mexican vaqueros, cattle herders who had been trailing stolen livestock north from Sonora, approached their camp with the cautious friendliness that characterized meetings between travelers in dangerous country. Their leader, an older man named Diego, recognized Sarah as Apache but showed no hostility or fear. Diego's news was both encouraging and troubling. The stolen cattle they were pursuing belonged to Mexican ranchers, who had been raided by the same Apache band that the military was seeking. But according to the vaqueros' information, those warriors were actually heading away from Sarah's reservation, driven south by cavalry pressure rather than returning to their families with the supplies they had hoped to obtain. This intelligence completely changed Sarah and Thomas's understanding of the military activity they had been avoiding. The soldiers weren't just conducting random patrols, they were actively hunting a specific group of Apache who had been raiding on both sides of the Mexican border. Unfortunately, this meant that any Apache found in the region would be considered guilty by association, regardless of their actual involvement in the raids. Diego and his companions were willing to share more detailed information about troop movements and safe routes, but only in exchange for assistance with their own mission. They needed someone who could track the stolen cattle across terrain where their own skills were inadequate, and Sarah's Apache training made her the ideal person for such work. Sarah found herself facing a difficult moral choice. Helping the Mexican vaqueros track stolen cattle would delay her return to her sick brother, possibly costing him his life. But refusing their request would mean traveling the remaining distance without the intelligence they needed to avoid military patrols, which could easily result in capture and the complete failure of her mission. Thomas saw her dilemma and proposed a compromise that demonstrated his growing understanding of the complex loyalties that shaped life on the frontier. Instead of simply helping track the cattle, they would work together to resolve the entire situation in a way that served everyone's interests. If they could locate the Apache raiders and arrange for the return of the stolen cattle, it might convince the military to reduce their patrol activity in the region. Sarah was initially skeptical of this plan, knowing that her people's desperation had driven them to raiding in the first place. The Apache warriors weren't stealing cattle for profit. They were trying to feed their families when government rations proved inadequate for survival. Simply returning the livestock wouldn't address the underlying problems that had created the situation, but Diego surprised her by revealing that he understood these deeper issues better than most white officials ever would. His own family had been displaced by American expansion into Mexican territory, and he recognized the signs of a people being slowly starved into submission. He wasn't interested in punishment or revenge, he just wanted to recover the cattle so that the Mexican ranchers could survive another season. The vaquero leader proposed an arrangement. that reflected the pragmatic solutions often found along the border, where survival mattered more than nationality or official policy. If the Apache would return the stolen cattle, Diego would provide them with other supplies that his people could spare: salt, metal tools, and ammunition that would be more useful for long-term survival than beef that would spoil quickly in the desert heat. Sarah agreed to help negotiate such an exchange, but only if Diego would first guide them safely past the military patrols that blocked their path to Apache territory. Time was running out for her brother, and she couldn't afford to spend days tracking cattle while he grew weaker, waiting for medicine that might save his life. Their modified plan required splitting into two groups. Thomas would accompany Diego and his men to locate the stolen cattle and the Apache raiders, using his status as a government courier to provide legitimacy if they encountered military patrols. Sarah would take Thunder and ride directly toward her reservation, following routes that Diego knew were currently clear of soldiers. This separation was emotionally difficult for both Sarah and Thomas, who had grown to depend on each other's skills and companionship during their dangerous journey together. But practical necessity demanded that they put Sarah's brother's life ahead of their own comfort and safety. If their mission succeeded, they could reunite later. If it failed, their personal relationship would become irrelevant. Sarah prepared for the final leg of her journey with the methodical care that Apache training had ingrained in her. She redistributed supplies to reduce Thunder's burden, while ensuring she had everything needed for wilderness survival. The medicine for her brother was carefully wrapped and secured against damage from rough travel or unexpected weather. As dawn broke over their temporary camp, the two groups prepared to separate and pursue their different objectives. Diego's knowledge of the country ahead had revealed a narrow window of opportunity, a 12-hour period when military patrols would be rotating positions, leaving a corridor open for fast travel toward the reservation. Sarah mounted Thunder for what she hoped would be the last stage of their incredible journey together. The great horse seemed to understand the urgency of their mission, his ears forward and his muscles tense with anticipation. He had carried them safely across hundreds of miles of dangerous territory, and now everything depended on his strength and speed for one final push. Thomas watched them disappear into the pre-dawn darkness with emotions he couldn't fully identify. In the space of a week, this Apache woman had changed his understanding of courage, survival, and the complex loyalties that defined life on the frontier. Whether they met again or not, she had given him something precious, a glimpse of what was possible when people chose cooperation over conflict. The sun was beginning to paint the eastern sky when Sarah and Thunder crested the final ridge overlooking Apache territory. Below them lay the reservation where her brother waited, hopefully still alive and fighting the illness that threatened his young life. Behind them stretched the trail they had traveled together, marked by challenges overcome and friendships forged in the crucible of shared danger. Thunder's steady breathing and strong heartbeat reminded Sarah that some partnerships transcended the boundaries that humans created to divide themselves from each other. The horse had never questioned her right to ride him or Thomas's decision to help her people. In his simple acceptance, she found a model for the kind of world that might be possible if fear and prejudice could be overcome by mutual respect and understanding. As they began their descent toward the reservation, Sarah offered a silent prayer to the spirits of her ancestors, asking for the strength to complete her mission and the wisdom to honor the unlikely friendships that had made it possible. The medicine in her saddlebags represented more than just hope for one sick child. It symbolized the possibility that understanding could bridge even the deepest divisions between different people struggling to survive in an unforgiving world. The reservation stretched before Sarah like a scar across the desert, its boundaries marked not by natural features but by the arbitrary lines that government surveyors had drawn on distant maps. As Thunder carried her down from the ridge, Sarah could see the familiar clusters of wickiups and government-issued tents that housed her people, a mixture of traditional Apache dwellings and the canvas structures that represented official attempts to change their way of life. The sun was already high and hot when Sarah finally reached her family's camp, her heart pounding with anxiety about what she might find. Her grandmother, whose weathered face had watched over the family through decades of struggle and change, emerged from the largest wickiup with an expression that mixed relief at Sarah's return, with worry about the boy they had all been fighting to save. Bright Star was still alive, but barely. The 12-year-old lay on a bed of blankets inside the family shelter, his breathing shallow and labored, his skin burning with fever despite his grandmother's constant care. The traditional remedies that had sustained Apache people for generations were proving inadequate against an illness that seemed to grow stronger each day that passed. Era knelt beside her brother and gently touched his forehead, feeling the dangerous heat that radiated from his small body. His eyes opened briefly at her touch, and she saw a flicker of recognition in their depths, but he was too weak to speak or even smile. The sight of his suffering filled her with a desperate urgency that made her hands shake as she unpacked the precious medicines she had carried so far to reach him. Her grandmother examined each bottle and packed it with the careful attention of someone who understood that these foreign substances might be their last hope for saving the boy's life. The old woman's knowledge of healing was vast, accumulated over decades of treating everything from battle wounds to childhood diseases, but she had always been willing to learn from other traditions when Apache methods proved insufficient. Together, Sarah and her grandmother prepared the first dose of medicine, according to the instructions that Thomas had carefully copied from the trader's directions. The process felt like a sacred ceremony, each measurement and mixture carried out with the precision that Apache rituals demanded. If this treatment failed, they would have no alternatives left except prayer and the hope that the boy's own strength would somehow prove sufficient. While they waited to see how Bright Star would respond to the medicine, Sarah's father returned from his daily work assignment with news that added complexity to her homecoming. Word had already spread through the reservation about her absence, and the Indian agent was asking questions about where she had gone and why she had left without permission. Someone had reported seeing an Apache woman traveling with a white man, and suspicion was growing about possible connections to the raiders who had been causing trouble throughout the region. This scrutiny put Sarah's entire family at risk. The reservation system operated on collective punishment, where the perceived misbehavior of one individual could result in reduced rations or increased restrictions for everyone in their band. If the authorities decided that Sarah had been involved with the Apache raiders, her relatives would suffer consequences that could be as dangerous as Bright Star's illness. Sarah's father listened carefully as she explained her journey with Thomas, weighing the risks and benefits of the partnership that had made her mission possible. He was a practical man who had learned to navigate the complex politics of reservation life, understanding when to cooperate with white authorities and when to pursue independent solutions to problems they wouldn't address. His assessment was both encouraging and sobering. The medicine Sarah had obtained might indeed save Bright Star's life, but the attention her absence had attracted could create new dangers for their family. They would need to craft a story that satisfied the Indian agent's curiosity without revealing details that might implicate Thomas or lead to punishment for the entire band. That evening, as Bright Star showed the first signs of improvement from his new treatment, Sarah sat with her grandmother beside a small fire and shared the full story of her incredible journey. The old woman listened without interruption, her ancient eyes reflecting firelight, as she absorbed details about the white cowboy who had risked everything to help an Apache family he had never met. Her grandmother's response revealed the depth of wisdom that had kept Apache people alive through centuries of challenge and change. She saw Thomas's actions not as an anomaly, but as proof that the fundamental human capacity for compassion could transcend the artificial boundaries that politics and prejudice created. Such individuals had always existed among all peoples, she explained, but they became visible only when circumstances demanded extraordinary courage. The old woman also understood the broader implications of Sarah's partnership with Thomas. Their successful collaboration demonstrated that Apache knowledge and white resources could be combined to solve problems that neither group could address alone. This lesson might prove valuable for future challenges that would require cooperation across cultural lines, but the immediate priority remained Bright Star's recovery and protecting the family from any consequences of Sarah's unauthorized journey. They developed a careful story that portrayed her absence as a desperate but solitary quest for traditional healing plants that grew only in distant mountains. This explanation would satisfy reservation authorities while avoiding any mention of Thomas or the complex negotiations that had made the medicine available. 3 days later, Thomas arrived at the reservation with his own carefully prepared story and official documentation that supported their planned explanation. He presented himself to the Indian agent as a government courier who had encountered Sarah during her plant-gathering expedition and provided assistance to ensure her safe return. His status as a federal employee and the travel papers signed by Major Harrison gave credibility to this account. The reunion between Sarah and Thomas was necessarily subdued, conducted under the watchful eyes of reservation officials who remained suspicious about the circumstances of their association, but both could see the relief in each other's faces. Relief that Bright Star was recovering, that their mission had succeeded, and that their dangerous partnership had somehow avoided the consequences that could have destroyed them, both. Thomas's visit to the reservation opened his eyes to the daily realities of Apache life under government control. He saw the inadequate housing, the insufficient food supplies, and the systematic destruction of traditional culture that was slowly killing a proud people more effectively than any military campaign. The sight filled him with anger and determination to find ways of helping that wouldn't endanger the very people he hoped to assist. When Thomas finally prepared to leave the reservation and return to his normal work as a courier, he carried with him a transformed understanding of the American West and his own place within it. His partnership with Sarah had shown him possibilities for cooperation and friendship that transcended the racial boundaries his society had taught him to accept as natural and permanent. Sarah watched him ride away on Thunder, knowing that their paths might never cross again, but grateful for the bond they had forged during their extraordinary journey together. She had saved her brother's life, but she had also gained something equally precious, proof that understanding and respect could bridge even the deepest divisions between different peoples struggling to survive. In a rapidly changing world, Bright Star's recovery became a source of hope for the entire reservation community, demonstrating that creative solutions and unlikely partnerships could overcome problems that seemed impossible to solve. The boy grew stronger each day, his laughter returning to brighten the family's wiki-up and remind everyone that the future still held possibilities worth fighting to achieve. Years later, when Bright Star had grown to become a respected leader who worked to bridge the gap between Apache traditions and modern realities, he would often tell the story of his sister's courage and the white cowboy who had risked everything to help save an Apache child's life. Their tale became part of the oral tradition that preserved the memory of moments when humanity triumphed over hatred, providing inspiration for future generations who would face their own challenges in building a more just and compassionate world.